Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to our webinar, Changing Environmental Engagement Practice Using a Connected Communities Approach to Grow Local Climate Leadership. We'll begin with a land acknowledgement. So we're on the territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Wendat, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, any other nations recorded and unrecorded who have taken care of this land. And we acknowledge the myriad of urban Indigenous folks who reside in Toronto. Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. As an immigrant myself and a settler, I was originally taught to be grateful for the opportunities this country provided without recognition of the ongoing colonial legacy and violence endured by Indigenous land defenders across Turtle Island. As we embark on this learning journey on improving environmental engagement practices, let us work towards an intersectional approach that furthers Indigenous rights and climate justice. With that, the Toronto Environmental Alliance, or T, is very pleased to be presenting this webinar with our partners from the Center for Connected Communities, C3, the Unison Bathurst Finch Hub, and Parkdale People's Economy. We're also launching our new resident engagement learning guide today. So, let's dive in. We're really excited to have folks joining us from across the country. In the chat, we invite you to share your name, affiliation, if any, and where you're joining from while we introduce the panel. Okay, so my name is Diane, and I'll be moderating today. I'm T's climate specialist and a master's candidate at York University, researching the intersection of affordable housing and climate mitigation. Previously, I worked at TAF, the Atmospheric Fund, and have been a longtime youth climate activist, such as being a founding member of Climate Justice Toronto. I'm joined by Umema Sharafali, Coordinator of Learning Opportunities at the Center for Connected Communities, or C3. Umema has spent over 7 years working on the ground as a facilitator for both residents and organizations, supporting local initiatives and collaborative processes. She loves using experiential and reflective learning as tools to harness collective wisdom and bring together all the different players that exist within a community's ecosystem. Our next panelist is Dr. Mandana Adarzadeh, who is the Community Engagement Lead at the Unison Bathurst Finch Hub. Mandana is an author, a speaker, empowerment coach, and social justice advocate. Mandana initially trained as a medical doctor, but gave up her medical career to focus on community development. She's mentored residents from Toronto's diverse neighborhoods and supported numerous community building initiatives. Our third panelist is Mercedes Sharp-Zayas, the planning coordinator for Parkdale's People Economy. Mercedes is a community planner committed to movement building and economic justice in the urban form. She's previously worked as a policy research intern at the City of Toronto's Economic Development and Culture Division, and as a research assistant for Metcalfe's Foundation Inclusive Local Economies Program. Lastly, I'd like to introduce T's Executive Director, Emma Ma. Emma has worked in the nonprofit sector for over 15 years in the field of child rights, health, and the environment. She's the former co-chair of Toronto Climate Action Network and a passionate advocate for building a more diverse and inclusive environmental movement. Thanks everyone for joining us. So we'll dive into Emma. Let's start and set the stage. Can you tell us a little bit more about the origin of the work we'll be discussing today and why T felt it was important to organize this webinar to share what we've learned?
Thanks very much, Diana, for the introductions, and thanks so much to everyone who's joining us. Really pleased to be with you today. I think I'll just start by saying that, recently I've been part of many forums where environmental sector folks are finally discussing the importance of adopting justice-based, equity-focused, and community-centered approaches to climate action. And a lot of these conversations are happening at the level of principles. So maybe a shared understanding is forming that those who are most directly impacted by climate change are often those least responsible for causing it. And their voices continue to be largely excluded from decision-making processes, which include policy, programs, and funding. and that as an environmental sector, we need to do something about this. We've spoken in these forums about the very distinct responsibility that our governments have to involving in a meaningful way Indigenous peoples in decision-making processes, and that we as settler organizations have a responsibility to right relations with Indigenous peoples and recognize their leadership, which connects very much to many of the issues that we have framed as environmental. And also to recognize where we are, that different peoples who are most impacted also include folks who are racialized, newcomers, people with low and moderate incomes, and people with disabilities. These identities often intersect, and many times they relate to experiences of precarious housing and livelihoods. So it's very important that these voices be put at the forefront of our climate action discussions. Yet when we take this sort of emerging understanding, which is long overdue, and we try to put it into practice, we find that there's a tension. And we want to have a really frank discussion today about that tension in the hopes that we can really start to address it in a meaningful way. And to me, the point of tension really emanates from the fact that as environmental organizations, we have very specific goals. Particularly when it comes to climate and trying to get people on board with climate solutions. It's not that these don't have merit, but they really run contrary to centering community voices, and they run contrary to community development and community building ethos. So that's one of the things that we want to really speak to today and share our own experiences as an environmental organization. For T, we really believe that, climate policy and programs are made better when residents lend their voices to shaping these. We've had a lot of experience working on environmental issues in an intersectional way, and yet we still experience challenges when we try to work with residents and build ground up climate solutions. And so we want to be genuine in sharing our own experiences and talk about the great learning that we've had. Today's webinar and our learning guide, Sowing the Seeds for Local Climate Leadership, draws from our experiences from one project in particular, Accelerating Neighborhood Climate Solutions Through Community Hubs. And this is a project that we delivered in partnership with C3, the Parkdale People's Economy, and the Unison Bathurst Finch Hub, all of whom we have present today, which is great. And really, in essence, this project was about looking at community hubs or community centers and the relationships that they have with residents and the tremendous social and physical infrastructure that they can bring to building climate solutions at a local level. And in this project, T really had to let go of a lot of what I would say is traditional environmental practice and learn from our partners and come with openness as well as a commitment to working in a different way. So we'll share some of those experiences today. We won't be going into the very detailed climate solutions that were developed through this project, because in the spirit of doing things differently, we really want to center the conversation on process and approach rather than detailed technical GHG reduction speak. Though we did have some really good success in terms of bringing the community development and environmental goals together, which we will talk about. So with that, I'll hand back to Diana and look forward to the conversation today.
Great. Thanks so much, Emma. So now we're going to move on to introducing the connected communities approach. Umema, as Emma mentioned, C3 collaborated with T on this project, drawing on your long history of place-based community development. To guide T's learning, C3 introduced us to the connected communities approach and the 10 keys framework. When we hand it over to you, we can go through an overview of what the approach is, the framework, and its relevance to community climate engagement work. So thanks, Emma.
Hi, everyone. So happy to be with you today. As Diana mentioned, I'm going to share an overview of some of the how behind community climate engagement work. So to get started, I just want to share a little bit about C3, Center for Connected Communities. We call ourselves C3 for short. We're a community development organization looking to center community across a wide range of issues and sectors through what we call the connected community approach. We developed this approach through over 20 years of successfully supporting residents to create meaningful local solutions in East Scarborough through an organization called the East Scarborough Storefront, where most of our staff, including myself, have previously worked before transitioning over to C3. Next slide, please. So the foundation of CCA is the idea of community ecosystems. Connected community approach, I'm going to just call it CCA for short. Oh, sorry, I missed a slide here, my bad. So just to talk a little bit about our climate work before I get into the connected community approach. So over the last 2 years, we've had the opportunity to support various groups to engage with communities around climate action work using the connected community approach. In addition to working with T, last year we designed a learning journey for grassroots leaders called CLEAN, in which grassroots leaders explored the intersection between climate work and community building work in the context of their neighborhoods, needs, and interests. And this year we designed a series of knowledge exchange events through a project called Towers in the Park, which brought together grassroots leaders, academic climate researchers, city staff, and environmental organizations to learn from one another around climate action work in Tower communities. And this was building a foundation of shared understanding for the co-design of a future project together. So now that you know a little bit more about us, let's get into the connected community approach. And I'm going to refer to this as CCA for short. The foundation of CCA is the idea of community ecosystem. So next slide, please. So we believe that neighborhoods are ecosystems, and in nature, when all the parts of an ecosystem are connected and in sync, the system thrives. So similarly, when all the various players in a community ecosystem are connected and working together, the community thrives. And strong community ecosystems are able to create local solutions to complex problems such as the impacts of climate change. The players in a community ecosystem include everyone to fully understand the problem and create a holistic solution. So how does a community ecosystem connect to climate work? Well, CCA is about building connected and thriving communities, and the work of community building shares a lot of alignment with the climate action movement. The goals that help us to mitigate and adapt to climate change can also help communities become stronger overall. For example, when a neighborhood economy is hyperlocal, not only does that reduce waste and transportation emissions, but it creates a more connected community. So I'm sure all of you by now are thinking, that sounds great. That's exactly what we're doing here in this webinar. How do I actually make this happen? Well, we've developed what we call the 10 keys. They can be used as guides in how to enact the connected community approach. In the interest of time today, I'll only go over a few of the keys, but more details on how each key can apply to climate engagement work can be found in the learning guide, which is a really great read. So next slide. When it comes to climate engagement work, I think we all start with great intentions. We want to meaningfully engage the community, create solutions that center community. We want residents to feel a sense of ownership for the project. These intentions are great, but what we've heard from many of our partners that we've worked with is that when it comes to how to enact these intentions, people often feel a little lost, especially when the time crunch and the funding pressure hits. They end up resorting to what they already know. What we've heard from many grassroots leaders that what environmental organizations already know tends to look like organizations coming into communities with a list of pre-designed solutions for residents to then pick from, or a lot of emphasis on wanting residents to recruit others that they know to the organization's cause and approach. So being those ambassadors in the community, or starting the process from scratch with each organization that comes into the community. So what does a connected community approach look like in this situation? So I'm going to go through 3 keys. The first one is letting values lead. This means starting with why. This means taking the time to build a foundation for your work together with residents and other ecosystem partners, creating a shared understanding of your project's purpose, intended impacts, values and principles that you'll use to make decisions together. And again, I feel probably a lot of you are thinking, this sounds great. It would also take a whole chunk of time that we just don't have for this project. I hear you. Our experience in community work has shown us that time and time again, by investing that extra time in the beginning of your work to really understand what brings and keeps all of the partners at the table, and what the purpose of the project is, it pays off tenfold in the long run. Oftentimes, when this is not clear from the get-go, a lot of the time is then used in the middle or end of the project, trying to keep everyone together or on the same page, especially when it comes to tough decisions about the process. So if you can invest this time beforehand, it'll pay off in the long run. The next key, build on everyone's strengths. It's about seeing the community you're coming into as ecosystem with many different strengths of knowledge, resources, networks, existing projects and processes. So instead of starting from scratch with the community, build on what's already there. So this includes acknowledging the foundation of connections, networks, resources, knowledge, and everything else that a community has worked so hard to build over time. This new project that you're creating will utilize that existing foundation to be successful. So it's important to acknowledge that. And with all of these questions that you'll ask about the strengths and momentum that already exist in the community, the key thing that really makes this key come to life is deep listening. And this means that ensuring you're listening with a holistic mindset to everything that's being shared. So taking time to understand how something that maybe on the surface feels a little irrelevant to climate work actually connects back to your shared project purpose. So in these conversations, not just having like those brainstorms where people list out different things, but really going a step deeper to understand why those things are important to them and how each of those things connect back to your shared purpose. So the last key that I'll touch on today, and again, there's so much to talk about with each of these keys, but it's all in the report, is prioritize equity and power sharing. So the foundation of this key is seeing communities as active and autonomous players in climate action work. This means not assuming that what you want to do in the project is going to be relevant or meaningful for them, and that they're not ambassadors for your organization's work, but rather they're ambassadors for the work that they choose to engage in with you as a partner. Most of us come in with this mindset, but often we fail to recognize where and when we're holding power, and how to share it in a co-creation process. So it's helpful to start by being transparent and naming the power that you hold, whether it be in the funds that you're holding, the timeline that you've kind of created and dictated, as well as the power that the funder holds. So being transparent about that from the get-go, what the needs and expectations are as part of this project funding. Also taking time to think about the decisions that are going to be made together and how those decisions will be made, which ones should be made together and which ones could be made by one partner in the project. And especially when it comes to decision making, your co-created purpose, values, and guiding principles that you would have made at the beginning of the project can be really strong tools to support these conversations to happen. So last slide here. So that's all I'm going to touch on for the connected community approach, just to give an overview. But again, everything else can also be found in the learning guide. And if you'd like to stick around for the discussion afterwards, we can talk more as well. And I'll pass it over to you, Diana.
Thanks so much, Emma. That was really helpful to go through. And now we'll move into the panel. I'm keen to dive deeper into showcasing how we embedded these insights into the Hubs project and climate actions in our neighborhoods. So Mercedes, and Dana, and Emma, and Emma, and we'll start with Emma. So what was T's starting point for learning to work in a community-centered way to support resident-led climate engagement? It's not traditional for a lot of kind of environmental organizations to take this kind of approach. And what did you learn from your community partners?
Well, I'd say the starting point was forming relationships with community partners who had long-standing histories in the neighborhoods where they work. And so I'm specifically talking about the Unison Bathurst Finch Hub and the Parkdale People's Economy. And we had relationships that we nurtured together before we plunged into implementing the project. And I think, and certainly Mandana and Mercedes will be able to speak to this more, but that was certainly key for us, not to just start with the doing, but to really work on our relationships and start developing some shared goals and emphasizing shared values in our work. So before launching into this work as T, it was really important for us to do some introspective work as an organization. And what we did was develop a theory of change. And we're very grateful that our partners came along this journey with us. And it really helped us to unpack our motivation for doing this work. Part of that theory of change, and it is in the learning guide, we've shared it with you, and it's our theory of change, and I hope that other organizations will develop their theories of change around this work, was to build out the framework. So it included environmental goals, like launching local climate solutions to ultimately reduce greenhouse gases, but it also included other goals around bringing certain voices to the forefront that have been continuously excluded, making sure that that climate work was linked to community priorities. And so building a much more holistic framework with which we use to hold ourselves accountable throughout the project and actually form the basis of an external evaluation. I would say one of the challenges that we encountered was that we felt some trepidation, even with such great place-based community partners, that we would make mistakes, that we would somehow go in and trample on community priorities. So part of this journey was really understanding the value that we could bring as an environmental organization and our experience and our expertise, and how we could pair that with residents' experience and expertise and with our community partners' experience and expertise. So understanding how we fit in and that there was a genuine role for us if we were open enough to follow a community building approach. And the other thing I would say around, what we were able to do with our community partners is that obviously, like all of us living in this world, we didn't anticipate what the pandemic would mean for the program that we designed together, but having that foundation of shared values really helped us pivot so that we were able to realize the same goals, but in a very different context, in a different format, in an online format. And the last thing I'll say is that we learned so much from our community partners in terms of how to interact with existing community structures and resources that were already established in these neighborhoods. One of the first things that our partners did for us was connect us to these structures and to residents that were already highly active and engaged. And that was so vital because that not only helped us plug in and link to really strong community assets, but it helped us understand context, so we wouldn't make some of the traditional sort of missteps of trying to bring our agenda without understanding how it connected to local priorities. So understanding how to make those human connections and understanding the local context was really at the core of the foundation for this work.
Yeah, that really resonates. I joined the Hubs project fairly late into the project, but I think that kind of tension around having climate priorities trump other existing community priorities, or being scared of not even talking about what kind of climate opportunities there might be because you don't want to kind of have this agenda. That is a real tension that I experienced. Maybe Mandana, can you speak to how you've been working with these resident leaders at the Unison Bathurst Finch Hub for many years, and many years before a climate change program was formally launched? So what were some of the capacity building processes that you supported, and why were these important for building a foundation for resident-led climate initiatives?
Sure, and thank you for the opportunity. I think the first and foremost important step was that we had this dedicated program to resident leadership support. It was called Action for Neighborhood Change, and it was in the Bathurst and Finch neighborhood for the past since 2007, basically. And so we had a good chunk of time to actually build and nurture this foundation. And I will talk about some of the points that how some of the strategies that we use. But I think having that dedicated community engagement body is so important, because I think, as Umema mentioned, we have to give that time at the beginning to build a relationship and build that foundation. And if we already have that existing, you can add any issue-based campaign or initiative to that. And if you don't have that foundation, you have to start from scratch, and it will take time. There is no I would say there is no way to really waive that time and process. So I think that was very important, having this dedicated community engagement funding and program there. That was number one. And in terms of what we did, I think some of the very shared things that other previous speakers said, we built on the existing leadership. When I started myself in 2011, I tried to headhunt a little bit to find these leaders that were in, faith-based group, grassroots leadership. There were this group of moms that, they advocated for their rights, single moms. There is all kind of leadership, formal and informal, and you need to find and connect to those leaders. Because those leaders become your mentors. Sometimes they are aware they are mentors, sometimes they are not aware, but people look at them and they follow what the steps that they do. Because if you go as a staff and try to engage in this formal empowerment kind of process, people see a distance between you and organization, and it's hard for them to adopt the staff as a role model. But they can easily look at a community member and adopt them as a role model. So what I did, I really brought this pool of leaders, and the next step was to build on where the energy is and what they are passionate to work on, rather than focusing on what the issues in the neighborhood. Of course, there is a lot of intersection between what they wanted to do, because they are all affected with the issues and problem in the neighborhood, but really listening to what they want to, what they feel empowered and have the energy. So where the energy goes, that's where the action happens. So we followed this lead, and actually that was the way that we connected with MA and then later on with Toronto Environmental Alliance, because there was a lot of energy in some of our residents for climate action way before we started this function, a few years before we started formal partnership. So that listening and building on what they are passionate and they wanted to work on, I think that was a very important key to our engagement process. The other thing is to meet the community members and meet leaders or residents where they are. Because a lot of time we are very excited about our work. We all come from a position and, we respect this movement and we want to give that leadership. But people are reluctant to take that leader kind of title. It takes them a while to really adopt and internalize that feeling of being a leader. They are a leader, but they don't look at themselves as a leader. So it's important to engage them wherever they are and whatever they wanted to do, to meet them where they are and just help them to move along the ladder of leadership or the journey of engagement. I think that's very important. And one thing that was a mantra for us is to really bring everyone with any amount of time that they can give us. It was okay, you have to commit to 5 hours per week. Even they had 1 hour per week, we try to engage them in some certain way. And I think it was our most important purpose to create different platforms for people to engage in different forms and with any amount of time and passion and investment of interest that they can. That was another key. And also, we lose a lot of fun in our work. We followed this model from Marshall Gantz, meet, act, and celebrate. So we try to do a lot of celebration because, social justice work can get really exhausting at some point because never-ending issues. There's always a new thing to tackle and new policy to change and new problem. So we try to make it fun. We did a lot of community events and we met a lot of our partners through these events. So we try to not to forget about celebration part. We did that very often. And of course, relationship building part is very, very important. And a lot of relationship building is fun opportunities and fun things that we do. And I think place-based approach really helped us because it helped us to bring people together that don't traditionally connect with each other. They are coming from their ethnic communities, religious communities that they mix and mingle naturally. But when there's place-based approach, it really helped us to bring people from different walks of life, different generation, and different defined community, because we all associate ourselves with so many different communities, to bring them in out of their traditional community and create a place-based, a neighborhood community. I don't know if I have more time, I can tell more, but I maybe.
Yeah, Mandana, that was really lovely. I think there are some
you.
really great insights in there. Mercedes, let's think about, like how this relates to your work. Parkdale, where you work, it's diverse, it's thriving in Toronto, and you have a unique community development initiative that is different than the kind of context that Mandano is describing, the Parkdale's People's Economy. Can you describe what that is and how and why our climate justice work that we did together was built on that foundation?
Sure. Thanks so much, Diane, and thanks for everyone so far who's gone. So yeah, I work for a project called the Parkdale People's Economy, and we are a network of over 30 different community-based organizations and hundreds of community members in the Parkdale neighborhood who are collaborating and building towards decent work, shared wealth, and equitable development in the neighborhood, especially in response to gentrification forces that are taking place. And in many ways, it's quite in alignment with the just transition model that folks on this call may or may not be familiar with, but a lot of our practices question how can we move from an extractive and exploitative economy towards one that's more regenerative and caring. And we do this work by really centering on local initiatives that center and prioritize economic, racial, and climate justice in making this possible. So back in 2016, the Parkdale People's Economy created a community plan that outlined a number of ways that we could move forward in our planning and organizing in a way that centers community well-being. And some of the big things that came out of that were things like creating a local food hub. So for those of you who are familiar, there's a plot of land in the neighborhood called the Milky Way Garden. It's one of the very first community-owned pieces of land through the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust. And on that site, there's currently a large-scale revisioning to imagine a full system food access hub that would allow for urban growing and also the production and potentially even vending of food and distribution of food towards community members. This kind of a hub model also is something that's kind of expanding more broadly. So we saw it, for example, taking place at the corner of Queen and Brock, where there's a number of publicly owned properties that are now being re-envisioned by the city. But thanks to supports through Toronto Environmental Alliance and broader groups coming in alignment, there's also been the opportunity to think about how this can actually be driving forward not only a community building model, but also one that's really centering climate justice in terms of the design. Another way of thinking about this too, of course, is that housing justice is a really core and central element, not only to Parkdale, but to the city and globally, of course, to any major area that's undergoing rampant financialization of housing. And so one thing we've been seeing that's been really interesting in Parkdale is, especially from the perspective of community-based and led housing initiatives. So whether that be for deeply affordable housing, supportive housing, that's being led by community-based and nonprofit groups, where they've been moving rather than going into an actual building of new homes. A lot of this actually requires acquiring and protecting existing homes that are at risk of being sold off to the private market and being upscaled and gentrified. And what's actually been happening through these community-based preservation models is that it's also looking at how to align with climate justice goals in terms of climate and energy retrofits, and how that can also create opportunities for local green jobs in the neighborhood. So these are all processes that are undergoing right now. We haven't necessarily hit that end goal yet, but we are in the midst of designing what this all can look like. And I think what's really important to note too about the way that we've approached, at least through the Parkdale People's Economy, the way that we've approached climate justice work, is that we've made a point not to separate out green initiatives from wider community-based goals, with the worry that this could actually also be inherent to a wider gentrification and displacement project if you are simply focusing on climate goals. And instead, what we've been really trying to do is integrate it as something that's interlinked and cannot be separated from broader goals such as housing justice, such as opportunities for decent work and opportunities for food security and making sure that that's really central to any of the community-based work that we're doing. So those are some of my insights for now.
Great, thanks, Mercedes. I think there's so much richness in that. I definitely feel like I relate a lot in my master's and thinking about that intersection of like housing justice and climate work as well. So maybe Mandana, back to you. One of the key elements of this program and our work together was developing the Climate Ambassadors Learning Program, which I think was shared a little bit. The case study was shared in the chat. And that was co-designed with resident leaders. They also participated in the programs as learners. So what made the process of co-designing a learning curriculum successful? And how did you actually ensure that the resident leaders were the ones making key decisions about the priorities and the content that they wanted to learn?
That was actually a very interesting process because right the time we started that was in March 2020. We just hit COVID. So they had to, as May mentioned, they had to pivot so fast into an online model. And a lot of our residents are actually seniors. So they had a lot of challenge with technology. But I was really impressed of how resilient these residents were, and they were so open to learning, and right away they started scheduling Zoom meeting themselves. They really put some time and energy to make this shift very, very successfully. And I think we started our workshops in May 2020. So it took them about 2 or 3 months to make that shift. And I think some of the key elements to that was, we use an empowerment model. I use an empowerment model in my work. And, since I do also a lot of coaching, sometimes I tell people I'm coaching, sometimes I don't tell them I still do it, is that we use a kind of, pulling them in and then pushing them forward and then let them do the journey. Just help them and support them from a distance. So, and when we engage them, we put a lot of energy to engage them in any ways. As I said, we try to engage anyone with any amount of time that they can dedicate to our work, because it's really not easy to find someone who has the willingness to come and do volunteer community work. We do our best to engage them, and after they engage and we give them some support and some resources, then we step back. We step back and let them lead. And I think when we started these workshops, actually, because after a few years of engaging these residents, we were at a stage that we actually passed the process, I would say, almost fully to them. I can say I try to not to participate, we intentionally divest from the process, we try to not to participate in those planning meetings as much as possible. If they asked us for a specific reason, we went and we helped them and support them in technical parts of the workshop, or if they want us to present a little piece there. But we actually passed the process to them and the support staff from T. And I want to just name Michael here, Michael Polani. He did a lot of work in getting this process going. And he was also a seasoned, I think, community development lead, and he knew how to also give this space and I would say decision making. So it's not that we gave them the space, they were the decision maker and they were brought us in. It was the reverse, because we have put the work in already during the years that we have worked with them. And for us, it's a dance. When you work with community members, you step in and you step out, and you have to learn. As you said, maybe have made our mistakes. I have so many times received a punch on my face of, no, we don't want to do this. This is your project. We are not interested in this. So I've learned a little bit when to kind of step out and divest from the process, let them do it. And I think as you work with them longer, they put more willingness to take the leadership. And for our specific kind of neighbor is a little bit difficult, because a lot of immigrants, first generation immigrant there, they come from the countries that they are not used to power sharing. They are not used to power to be shared. So it takes them a while to accept that position. But I think in our group of residents, we have successfully passed this process. And I think those were the keys to giving them the stage, and they really did an amazing job.
Yeah, absolutely. Mercedes, so when in Parkdale, we co-hosted the Parkdale Climate Justice Circles. It's interesting because I think when we first conceptualized this project, the Climate Ambassadors training and the Parkdale Justice Circles were kind of supposed to be the same thing, but they evolved in very different ways. The resident advisors in Parkdale who participated in establishing the circles decided a key learning priority was writing relations with Indigenous peoples and understanding how Indigenous knowledge can guide climate justice work. So why, in your opinion, like why did the residents feel like this was so important, and how did this priority integrate into the residents' learning program?
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, I think it's worthwhile to note, the advisors that we had originally on our initial circle came, of course, from many diverse backgrounds, many of which were either refugee or immigrants, similar to Mandana's statement. Folks who, of course, historically have come here forcibly through slavery, as well as folks who more broadly are here as settlers. And I think in recognizing everyone's positionality through this work was also recognizing that climate justice work itself is inextricable from Indigenous-based land defense and movements that are taking place for self-determination. And so in recognizing the groups and the community's positionality, really wanted to make sure the center and forefront Indigenous knowledge and visions and leadership in terms of how to be able to move forward in terms of any type of climate-based work. So we were very honored to be able to have an Indigenous knowledge keeper join us, Joss Tucros Tremblay, who was really able to share their framework and visioning for writing relations with Indigenous peoples. And we're able to really center this on a couple core frameworks for us to embark on our journey in building this work in the neighborhood. Part of that, of course, is recognizing that we are all treaty people. And so very much so in line with the values and spirit, for example, of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Treaty, which really is an agreement between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee in terms of peaceably sharing the resources of the land. We were able to really draw from those types of values and principles to be able to guide how our work moves forward, especially given that so much of what we do is about redistribution of wealth and recognizing how so much shared knowledge and resource exists already within communities that can help lead and guide this work. Another key element of that in that notion of sharing knowledge is also this idea of regenerative reciprocity, which came forward, which is really recognizing the ways that communities can look out for and support one another in all forms of relations. So whether that be with one another as human beings, whether that be with other living beings on this earth, as well as the land and the water. And in recognizing that, I think we've seen so many beautiful practices emerge, especially during COVID-19, that draw very much so from Indigenous practices, mutual aid being, of course, a core element of that, that we've seen really grow throughout the pandemic. And of course, Joss also brought much other, beautiful insights around ideas like restoring, which is bringing together the process of restoration with storytelling to draw light to impacts of genocide, colonization on these lands, and to the Indigenous communities that continue to survive and continue to put themselves on the lines when it comes to the forefront of environmental work that's taking place. And so recognizing all of these elements of work that is taking place and really honoring that, and then moving then from a space of, as we were talking about throughout this whole panel, is going back to that process of relationship building and continuing to follow leadership and power where it currently sits, especially in thinking about that Indigenous solidarity that we're trying to build. So those are some of the core insights. It's still, once again, a process that's ongoing for us in this work, but when we were able to at least begin to embark on through this partnership.
Thanks, Mercedes. Like really powerful and really, I think there's just so much to learn that I've learned out of the recording that we've shared, the writing relations session. So I have one last question for the panel, and then we'll move into audience questions, hopefully. So Mema, We've talked a lot about learning, but it can also take a lot to unlearn traditional approaches, specifically with environmental outreach. What advice do you have for environmental organizations that want to shift more community-centered approach, shift to more community-centered approaches in their climate engagement work?
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge and a journey. Some of the advice that I would have is to start where you can. If you're able to start in the proposal writing process and really build in some time, I think what we've heard from all of the panel speakers today is that it takes time and it has to come naturally to what the needs and wants of the community are. So if you're able to build in more time from your proposal writing at the get-go, that's great. And when you're in a time crunch, sometimes less is more. So building in more time for learning, sharing, reflecting, co-creating. When it comes to community engagement, a good process will lead to a good product. So sometimes we often get really caught up in, we need to have all this content and we need to go through all these steps in order to achieve our outcome. But oftentimes, if you've got a really good process, that good outcome is bound to come with that. And I think the other thing is thinking about, being realistic in proposal writing. Oftentimes you have to plan out all your outcomes from advance. And even if you want to leave space and time for the community to decide certain things, there's certain things that the funder is also looking for that you need to align with. It's definitely a balancing act, but I think the best thing you can do is be really transparent and honest and treat the community as a true partner. So, this is where our funding is coming from. This is what is required from it. These are some of the outcomes that we kind of had to prescribe to, and here's the places where we have flexibility and room to form what's needed for the community. So I think when it comes to writing those proposals, as when it comes to enacting the proposals, it's all about creatively thinking about how you could meet everyone's needs. And if you can engage the funder as a partner on your journey, that's the best situation, I would say. And I think overall, just keep in mind that purpose, people, and process will always give a really great outcome when you're doing community work. That would be my advice.
Awesome. Thanks, Amanda. So we have a question here from Helen. She says, "Hi panelists, how do you ensure that disabled people help set the agenda? This equity-seeking population often feels sidelined in enviro/climate action." So maybe Mercedes, I'll start with you on this, and Mandana or Emma, feel free to chime in if you'd like after.
Yeah, this is a really important point, Helen. And I'd love also, of course, any insights that you have to share in this, as I'm sure you have some. But I can say, at least for the Parkdale-based work, when it comes to, for example, where we're located in terms of the Parkdale People's Economy, a lot of our work is grounded out of a drop-in center called the Parkdale Activity Recreation Center, which is a space for folks who are experiencing mental health and substance use issues, as well as any other forms of poverty or disability that may be impacting them. So by virtue of, in many ways, where we're centered and where we're grounded, many of the folks who are helping guide and lead our work identify as folks living with disabilities. And I think, once again, though, it is really integral to ensure that there are accessible spaces and welcoming spaces for folks living with disabilities to be able to build out core visions for what this looks like. And once again, it kind of goes back to that notion that we sometimes can't silo out all of these different areas as being different. It's about bringing in unique perspectives and making sure that it's leading towards a collaborative, cohesive, community-based vision for what can be possible. For example, when talking about those retrofits of housing, that accessibility and disability rights and justice has to be central to how we're actually ensuring that folks can continue to live and thrive in these spaces that are then meant to be sustainable. So that's just one example of a way that we've done that. When we were meeting in person, of course, we would always make sure that our spaces, of course, were accessible to all in terms of access. But then, of course, now in our current day, we've been looking at ways when it comes to, for example, Zoom meetings, making sure we have live transcriptions, making sure that we have translation as another form of accessibility, and a number of other pieces. So there's so much more to continue to build out. So I'd love to hear other people's knowledge and insights on this, but that's just one example of how we go about it.
Yeah, those are great points, Mercedes. Something I've learned in kind of through Climate Justice Toronto is, how sometimes activism can be really built off this like sense of urgency and the kind of ableist nature and stigma that plays into, the kind of pace and the speed of needing to do so much as we're, even the language of like being in an emergency and like what that yeah, how that can unintentionally exclude disabled folks. Maybe Mandana, another question we have from the audience: how did you apply a social justice lens to the way you engaged in and with community?
So it goes a lot to educating, because we work with a different range of people. Some people are really into social justice. They know the elements of it. They know the principles and values it. And some people are new to it, because as I said, we get a very diverse range of people to work with. I think it's important to put that on the table at the beginning when you start to form a group or gather around some collective work for something. It's important to talk about those values, but it will take a process and lay out those values and put it as in your terms of reference or guiding principle, whatever work you have. But I think it will take some time and some practice to actually incorporate them, because you have to refer back to them. You have to have an agreement for people to not take it like personally if you have a conversation or you bring up something. I think it's important to look at it as a process which takes a self-reflection, education for everyone who is part of the process, not necessarily for certain, for everyone who is part of this process, and also a commitment to practice. I think that those are the elements that helps to include the social justice lens into our work.
Awesome. Thanks, Mandana.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Emma, how do you and I guess T overcome the performative nature that community engagement can be?
Well, I think that, some of our partners on this panel have really spoken to that already in many ways. I think for us, I'll speak from our environmental organization perspective. I think for us, it was to really let local priorities rise to the surface. So we were very lucky to be part of these very vibrant discussions that were facilitated by residents in each neighborhood. And as a result of joining in on those rather than trying to come and set the agenda, we were able to remove what I would believe is a performative element. So rather than asking people to do certain things, perform certain roles, those roles were assumed organically. They were assumed by folks who wanted to play them. I'll give a very brief example. A lot of the push and a very important issue for us as an organization when it comes to climate action is buildings. We could easily have come in and said, we'd really like residents to organize energy efficiency workshops. At the end of the day, after we'd gone through a whole learning process through the Climate Ambassadors program, one of the resident leaders organized a senior session and invited city folks to present about measures that could be taken for home energy efficiency. We did not prescribe that. That was completely resident driven. So that just shows, to Emema's point about the value of letting processes flow and ride and result in their own outcomes. So just wanted to give that example.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. Yeah, that workshop was super interesting. And partly, one of the residents had gone through the energy efficiency animated training by the City of Toronto. And then we worked through, what does it mean to adapt that kind of workshop to a neighborhood group, a seniors group, and then even though it was meant to be a seniors group, it was an intergenerational audience. I think I may spoke a little bit to the question Amanda put in, but yeah, maybe Umema, if you want to address just really quickly kind of how does education around what climate action is like plays into this work, because I know that's been a lot of the different focuses you've had with C3.
Yeah, I think when it comes to climate action education, coming up with a co-created definition, because it does mean different things to different people, and creating a shared understanding is really important. And when it comes to quote unquote educating the community around climate action, what it means, definitely getting a sense of your audience and where they're at and what they'd like to learn. So allowing them to lead their learning journey makes a big difference in that education process.
Awesome. And yeah, I think when we think about this as a city and regional scale kind of policy work, I think some of the kind of targeted approaches that we've spoken to, like being neighborhood and place-based, even if, it's like supposed to be for all residents, it doesn't impact all residents equally, and I think having specific insights from specific communities does really make a difference into how policy is designed and implemented. So that's kind of the formal end of our panel. On behalf of T, I would really love to take the opportunity to thank our panelists, Mama, Mandina, and Mercedes. Thanks to everyone who submitted questions and participated in the chat. And, I hope you find the learning guide helpful. We look forward to keeping this conversation going.